break. I'm sorry about the delay in posting this. Please follow along. As each page you flip, there will be a new audio file for you to listen to. The lecture will be a little bit shorter than it would be in class, but hopefully we'll cover the material as needed. Before we begin talking about the details of the readings and the framing within the discussion of ethics, I think it's important that we actually understand what we're talking about. The internet is often discussed as if it's one monolithic thing, but we, within that larger category of the internet, actually refer to multiple things. In the past, I've had discussions in class which focus on other elements besides the obvious within the internet. This week, for time's sake, we'll just talk about one or two of the issues around the internet. The internet as a whole is usually an experiential element. That is, we're mostly referring to what could be considered the World Wide Web protocols and the user interface. And in an old picture from the board in a previous semester, I had suggested that one way to visualize it is that that is the surface of the mechanism of the internet. Below that, the deep net, deep internet, or technical internet is the combination of files, software, etc., which allows that user interface to function. Within that deep internet, there is a significant volume of elements that are interacted with, that have user interfaces of their own, often distinct and different coded and allowable behavioral elements. One part of that sub-internet or deep internet is often referred to as the dark web. That is, those places which are comparable in some functional elements, such as shopping, but are removed from the internet for privacy. And the largest technical component of the distinction between the surface internet and the below is whether it is indexed. And we'll come back later in the lecture to talk about the importance of indexing by standardizing and producing a conception or an understanding of the internet that bases it purely on accessibility of information. We change what kinds of parts of the internet are valued and thought about. Huge amounts of information, significant components of what the internet really is, are decentered, disaggregated, or removed from our conception of the internet because they are not as easily accessible. And when we come to the discussion of content control and message control in Sherry Turkle's work, I want you to understand that this is already happening in the use of Google and other elements that interact with and produce the internet's index. That is, that makes some information on the internet meaningful at that surface level. We prefer and interact preferentially with components of the internet that are easier to find. And so, for instance, greater reliability of information is often less important to people searching for information than less important information. As a separate element, that importance of efficiency or of accessibility, as we usually talk about it, which is largely about ease of use and desirability of use, can actually be a downside. So we can consider the fact that not all internet is actually one thing. International banking uses a distinct and non-connected internet for banking, whether you're talking about an ATM or bank transfers between banks or major financial actions done on the stock market. Those internets are not attached to the regular internet. While the technical components are very similar, and in some cases they make use of the same wires and lines to transmit information, they are not the same thing. And similarly, the military of almost all major countries have their own stable and disconnected internet that is related to but not part of the general internet as we usually consider it. And in some ways, this harkens back to a historical period where the internet was, we sometimes describe it as balkanized, that is, national or components that are considered separated, identified separately, and which are patrolled between borders between them. And some parts of the internet maintain those kinds of divisions. In the past, I've done a longer form of timeline discussion from the rise of pre-internets, that is, systems for individual computers or computer clusters to talk to other computer clusters, things like BBSs and even ARPANET, which was a predecessor technology that was used to test conceptual possibilities of the internet by the military. Those elements precede the modern internet. And for today, what we really want to talk about is the basic, what is the internet? And we're going to keep in mind that paralleling what Lessig is going to talk about later, the internet is really four different things interconnected. It is, first of all, a complex network of computers, servers, switches, software, the connection devices, which can be wires or digital signals that are wireless, the data and content, the web protocols, and other protocols for user interface. And those are all built artifacts that are produced over the last, really, for the most part, the last 25 years, although some components of the modern internet that we would recognize date back to about 1992. And it's worthwhile keeping in mind that all of what we think of as the internet, no matter how naturalized in your experience, really only exists in the last 30 years. And your generation, your ability to proceed and enact with the internet is dependent on the assumption that it is a stable and appropriate device. But one of the things that we want to continually argue about with the position of engineering ethics is that it is worth reconsidering and reconceiving the development, the form of different technologies as we go. 30 years is not a long time in the long scheme of history. If elements of the design of the internet are no longer appropriate, no longer functional, or no longer beneficial, you really can consider that to be a possibility for redesign. Now, on top of that technical infrastructure or architecture, there are social norms, patterns of use, and belief, and a huge component of what the internet is really social. How you read things, how you respond to things, how you understand things, whether people conceive of email as an appropriate and useful form of communication, whether they see something like Skype as being as desirable as Zoom. All sorts of valuations, considerations, and patterns of belief produce a huge amount of what the internet is. And at one silly end of that, there are the production of things like memes, where only a very small component of their meaning is represented in the image. At the far end of that is things like the pattern of usage of the internet being largely developed as English. And in contrast, those regions of the planet where people have chosen not to use the internet in English have by and large produced different internets on top of that. In some cases, translation, simultaneous or asynchronous, is possible, but by and large, the internet, as it's been developed over the last 30 years, has become another form of balkanization based on language. Now, not to the same degree that it was in the era from, say, 1990 to 2000, when things like Usenet became an example, and you had Prodigy, AOL, and other services which literally prevented intercommunication between portions of the internet. In the contemporary form, these linguistic barriers are softer social barriers as opposed to replicated and produced through the technological architecture of the software. But really, there is a significant layer of the internet that is a component that is social. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that the interaction of that social and technical element, as we go back all the way to Langdon Winter and other scholars that we've read this semester, those produce significant political effects. Within and connected to both of those, we can see business and ownership, value systems, economic patterns, incentives, and costs that are inherently directive to both elements within the internet and the internet as a whole. And so business elements and considerations become one of the central components of what the internet is. For instance, it took almost 9 years, the better part of 10 years, between the rise of rapid use, widespread development of the internet as a communication medium before strong encryption forms allowed direct payment and credit card use online. And it was a dramatic change to reorganize the internet around the forms of communication that economic actors needed. By contrast, we can see in the Lessig reading and in our own experiences that there have been legal and structural changes in what the internet is. Many of you will remember fights, even if you did not understand them, about the issue of net neutrality in recent years. And we'll come back to that. One of the key concepts that we'll talk about is that because the internet is a system of information, control, transfer, and recording, it is a medium. One of the key elements that we'll have to evaluate as an ethical question will be, general good or not, the question of censorship. All right, so that's where we'll leave off for today on this general thing. We'll move on to the next slide and focus on trying to situate ourselves in other issues, specific issues. So before we even get into the general issues of ethics, I ended the last slide mentioning that one of the issues in any system of information provision, any medium, that is anything that carries, conveys, and communicates information, is censorship. And censorship is often considered in popular definition to be government censorship, but that's not actually true. Censorship, by definition, is simply the prevention of access to information that exists. And in one important aspect of that would be legal or governmental censorship. But I want you to recognize that over the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen an increasing volume of discussion, including things like Google's search indexes prioritizing some information or others, the priority or misdirection, the accidental or unintentional erasure of things for breaking community norms on YouTube, the process of removing, not removing, controlling content on social media platforms, the decision to remove nudity and adult content from Tumblr, hundreds of key and important issues that are derived from the issue of corporate, public, or business-related censorship are not governmental. And in fact, in many cases, because they're not governmental, in the United States and in many national legal structures, those examples of censorship are non-regulated by legal authority. There is no right of free speech on a privately held business platform. And if we can look at the world and say it is harder and harder for people to function without these business platforms, one of the ethical questions that you will be faced with in your generation is whether or not the nature of censorship has, as a pendulum, has swung so that large corporate actors are the great threat, not governmental censorship. And we can even see this in the real debates about governmental censorship in China. It is harder because of the technical elements and architecture of the internet in China to get information from outside China. But it's actually not impossible. And if it was impossible, it would be following the dictates of control by the government. The rapid accessibility of information on the internet is fundamentally difficult to police by governments. Someplace which has the level of degree of control and strength that China does would be expected to do it very well. And in some ways, they do it as well as can be predicted. By contrast, though, when somebody like Netflix or when Facebook or Google determines that they want content removed from the internet because they're not using a legal barrier, they're using a structured mechanical architecture barrier wherein the programming is changed, and they've developed tools to do that. they are far more effective. And the difference in enablement there between legal censorship by governments or self-determined censorship by business actors that run and manage the infrastructure of the internet, we come back to the issue that came up in previous weeks, that of standardization allowing different political effects. And so in the first week, we talked about standardization around the system of evaluation in the Pinto case. Then we talked about how in the case of IBM and their pursuit of rationalization and doing what could be done, they developed computers in such a way that the ability to act relied on the translation to data, that is, the removal of context and details to produce a simplified version. And often it is at this point in the lecture that, as you guys wonder why I'm talking about datafication instead of talking about censorship, that we do the example of digital versus acoustic recording of music, and I'll demonstrate how when you record music onto a record, you are producing an actual imitation, a direct and complete imitation of a sound wave, and that because of the form of information recorded on an old-fashioned record being complete, it means that even if we lost all of the forms of digital production of sound, one can in fact make a mechanical device that can do it. We'll never lose the capacity to play old records. But a significant component of data that is produced, music that is produced in digital format, unless somebody takes the time to translate it into modern or contemporary formats, it is effectively lost. The meaning of that data ceases to be meaningful. And that's a really clear example of the process of simplification that datafication or digitalization produces. And when we move into talking about social results of technology in this lecture, when we start talking about the concerns that Sherry Turkle has, I want you to keep in mind that this is not an accusation. This is a fundamental technological function of computers, as it was during the census in 1936 by IBM, as it was and is in the development of communication channels online. The nature of datafication means that we are always making choices about which information is worth recording and which information is left out. That while I have started out by saying that there is an important transition from governmental censorship to business interest censorship, the nature of technology, especially in translation of the internet, and especially as the internet becomes the archive, the storage place, the central way for all information to be gathered and shared, it is absolutely imperative that you realize that every time you put something on the internet, some pieces of information are added, taken away. Someone has made choices that shapes those things that you're seeing, hearing, recording, sharing. And at its very basic level, that means that those traditional definitional worries about whether information can be lost, whether everything is on the internet, are far more complicated than we give them credit for. And so before we move into the broad discussion of socialization online, I want to just touch upon three very specific things, all of which will be less important for our reading-based discussion, but are worthwhile topics to keep in mind as we move away from the general, this is what the internet is. And the first of those, that question of censorship, becomes central to the question of net neutrality. The censorship issue, who has control, where controls are, is not an easy one. It relates to the conception of the commons. The commons is the idea that derives, certainly since the 1960s, it's related to computers and technical information, but it was the commons that was one of the motivations for the sharing of information in the development of the sciences in the 15 and 1600s. The commons as a concept goes back to religious discussions in the second century AD at very least. And by contrast, we have to be able to understand that if you're talking about the commons, one of the things you're talking about is intellectual property, the ownership of information and ideas. No discussion of datafication, standardization online of the internet can ever ignore entirely that we are talking about technologies that have, by definition, to exist within a system where all information is considered to be ownable. And the term for the ownership of that information, of those ways of doing and thinking that are represented by that information, is intellectual property. So we will continue on towards the readings, but we are moving into talking about issues of regulation that Lessig brings up and issues of the exchange of dialogue within the use of computers from Sherry Turkle, by thinking about these larger issues with the internet. So we'll end this slide here and we'll move on to the next one. The concept of the commons dates back historically to ancient times, and basically is the idea that something, whether it's land and property or human dignity or information or religiously the presence of God, that individual ownership is not the way to consider and manage a thing. And in the Western tradition, we actually, believe it or not, don't just derive the communal good in a socialist system. We also derive the communal good in capitalism from the idea of the commons. And the way that works is that Adam Smith and other philosophers who founded modern Western capitalism argued that because there was a common ownership of nature by all human beings, the ownership by an individual was justified because they improved upon, added to, or innately increased the value of the natural world. So, for instance, you could grab a piece of land and build a house on it, and by doing so, you had produced the value on that land. But that was not necessarily the case for somebody simply claiming ownership without improving value. And the idea that there has to be an improvement, an increase in value, and a communal good to individual property rights is not a radical one. This is actually the warrant by which the ethical claim for individual ownership of property is based in Western society. Now, the general idea of the commons, that whatever you're talking about is or is not subject to or owned by everybody, is fundamentally linked to the ideas of stewardship and cooperation. So mostly we don't talk about the commons anymore in a general sense, but there are very specific places where even within modern capitalism, even within the selfishness and self-directed economic action that we come to expect, we still maintain certain ideas of the commons. For instance, the importance of firemen serving everybody and not only some people requires that we see some element of the commons. The fact that we pay taxes so that libraries are available to everybody instead of hoarding all information is based on the idea that there is a greater value in the commons, in the sharing of information, because the collaboration of members of a society in an educated society will produce greater value for every individual than any one individual could manage on their own. So when we talk about the commons, what we're really doing is identifying specific aspects or elements or technologies or resources from which general benefit is recognized and important. And that's what the cooperation is. For instance, if the internet is for everybody, is requisite for everybody, is needed by everybody, then we have to manage it differently. So in a recent study, it was pointed out that it is difficult for homeless people to get on the internet except at the library, but almost 90% of job ads and almost 90% of paperwork to do economic and social development has moved online. Now, you can go to an office and do much of that with a case manager or somebody at an NGO who will assist you in the paperwork. But if 90% of that paperwork, knowing that it's available, knowing that those kinds of services exist, has to be accessed online, there are not other ways to learn about it, then that means that there is a fundamental need. And if access to that need is then something that everybody can be considered to have a right to, then it is appropriate often for us to see it as a commons. And in general, in the United States, we distinguish between those things that can be managed as a commons for general cooperative benefit and those things that don't. And one of the ways we do that is by legally labeling something as utility. So for the last 20 years, one of the big fights has been whether or not the internet should be considered utility. As it's become more and more important to people, as it's become central to the way that we live, how can we or can we not call it a utility? Could it be the same? Is it different than something like access to drinking water, access to electricity, access to housing? Now, internationally, the concept of human rights has been more successfully enshrined in law, but in the United States, this is largely a debate that has taken place in cultural grounds, what people believe as opposed to being enshrined in law. And a while ago in class, we talked a little about the distinction between cultural contract or social contract and rights. In tradition, the idea of the commons and that there are some things that are necessary for the cooperative living of everybody is related to the requirements of human rights. In the United States, where rights have a much weaker position compared to social contract-based governance, that is citizenship rights as opposed to human rights, that is legal rights as opposed to basic rights, that are dependent on the way and who of who you are. Those distinctions mean that we have a weaker time justifying the transition of the internet into a commons, into a utility. One of the sad parts about that is that consistently over the last 30 years, we have acted as if we can rely on it as a utility despite not building it as a utility. In the discussion of what the internet is, I talked very briefly about it being an interconnection of computers. And one of the things is that early in the system of developing the internet, largely all computers were seen as equal. And in fact, it was very possible for someone to effectively run a computer that was a server in their bedroom closet and be their own internet portal. They would still need telephone service, but telephone service was provided by the utility of telephones, which were regulated for general benefit. And what happens is that as we want to move into the era of high-speed internet, there is a break where people pause and say, instead of focusing on the cooperation component, we will be reminded of the importance of stewardship. One of the great fallacies of modern times is that people remember that there is an argument called the tragedy of the commons, that if the commons exists, then everybody will steal from it and it will get used up. And the tragedy of the commons is, believe it or not, a very real argument, but it is not a true one. The commons that is unregulated, unlimited use by selfish actors can get used up. And so in general, The commons in all conditions, in all situations, whether you're talking about the intellectual commons of scientific knowledge, whether you're talking about common grounds, the actual term the commons comes from the common grazing ground of England, despite worries about it. In fact, no one has ever, in practice, found that the tragedy of the commons takes place if it's actually a commons. And part of the reason for that is that when people accept and base their actions on the warrant of the commons, on the justification that they can use it because they're part of it, they accept the responsibility to maintain and take care of that thing in commons. And one of the interesting things about this is this idea of stewardship, that each person is cooperatively participating in maintaining the commons, has been extremely effective historically. There is a really sad part that the argument that the tragedy of the commons, that people's selfishness will destroy the commons, actually really plays out much more after you take the commons away. The assumption following from the tragedy of the commons is that having individual ownership of components will mean that people will protect their investment. And what we've seen in environmental damage, political action, business interests, largely people are very willing to use up something they own. And the reality of the commons is that it is only functional with the inclusion of stewardship. And once you have both cooperation and stewardship in maintenance, then what we end up with is a system that is by its nature, because it is providing for all, and because everybody shares in the responsibility of maintenance, we have a system that is built for a great deal of equity, that is fairness of function. So the concept of the commons is really important when we talk about the internet, because everybody here, each person in this class, potentially, is expected to have equal access to the internet. You are expected to have high-speed access. I am supposed to be expecting that you should be able to get on anytime as you like from the house. You won't have competition, you won't have power outages, you won't have problems that demand attention. Now, I've chosen, as a form of equity building, to not make you come on for me to give a lecture live. I recognize that we do not have equitable and equal access to the internet. But the question about the commons then becomes, can we and should we choose to develop an internet, forms and technologies of internet that are more equitable, and is the better way to do that? The commons, where we protect equivalent and appropriate cooperative access, or do we continue moving in the form of divided, balkanized internet? And one element of that becomes particularly important in this day and age is the more balkanized, the more you allow ownership, the less claim you have to limit the censorship by those people who own portions of the internet. For instance, 1 billion people on Facebook, I should say just about 1 billion active users and well over 1.5 billion total users, cannot communicate in language, in ways, in content that they choose without following rules set by what is really about 10 people at the corporate office of Facebook. Their interests at Facebook are limited, and they argue that they are developing and promoting maintenance of the commons of the Facebook. But we know from past experience, we know from their comments, that the ways that they do that are self-serving. And so how we moderate, how we enact stewardship for a community product, for a community held ownership, for a commons, what elements of the technology, what elements of the social contract, what element of the social norms you apply on that dramatically change the object. And we'll move on from the commons to talking about one of the fights over it in the United States and internationally, called net neutrality in the next slide. One of the great ironies of the internet is that when we first started talking about net neutrality,
when we first started using that term. The discussion really hadn't been as accurate as it is now. The nature of the internet as getting more and more important, as increasingly the location where economic action and large business decisions are being done, the importance of it as a cultural marker and as a success marker for large companies has meant that ownership and control of different parts of the internet has become a fairly active fight. And the kind of predictions that were originally were much smaller scale. Now, net neutrality came to a large popular attention fairly recently when, at the beginning of Donald Trump's term or the end of Obama's term, we had, starting in 2014 and really resolved in 2016, we had a big fight that ended many of the protections of neutrality. And one of the pictures on the screen, if you're interested, is a timeline sort of general introduction to how that series of decisions happened. Starting in 2004, we defined not necessarily the internet as a commons, but we predicted that conflicts over control of the internet would be bad for everybody, and we limited some forms of conflicts within the potential arena of the internet. And starting in 2005, that debate was largely settled until after 2012, when a group of free market driven forces recognized that they could profit by the removal of those limitations. And as a largest group in that, it was, in fact, not the ISPs, the service providers, the Comcast, AT&T, Verizon. It was a subset of investors in them who had pushed towards decrease in net neutrality rules so the profit margins could be even higher. And between 2000 and 2001, when net neutrality as a concept began in 2014, one of the things that had happened is the balkanization, the divide in the internet, had gone from being a stable, technically different, an architecture divide, where you literally could not access AOL from outside AOL, you could not access Prodigy from outside Prodigy. The barriers were very strong. Starting in 98 and 99, the transition to what was at the time called Web 2.0, where you did not have a balkanized internet. What we find is that service platforms become very balkanized in their platform within the internet, but not the internet architecture as a whole. And so one of the classic divides of this is, for people today, is which television show will appear on which platform. A few years ago, Disney started to produce its own platform. And what we've really done is removed the balkanization from internet platforms to informational platforms within the internet. And the platform systems where we differentiate content providers inside of the internet is actually a really strong argument towards conceptualization of the internet as a commons, but other people would disagree with me. The nature of the fight since 2012 has been that the increasing usage of some content provider platforms within the internet means that some content provider platforms, for example, the largest being Netflix, seem like they are getting more use of the internet's wires, of the transmission systems than other people. And internet investors and ISPs, the actual companies that run the backbone wires, thought that they should be able to charge Netflix more to send every bit of information than other people's using the internet. Now, you should recognize that in the current crisis, internet usage has actually increased and Netflix watching has actually increased we don't have those numbers as easily, but even before this, almost 35% of high peak hours on the internet, that is not just actually evenings, that is work hours also, almost 35% of internet traffic goes through Netflix, and depending on the day, almost 50% of internet usage is the streaming media platforms. And so there's a quantitative argument that this attack on net neutrality, the argument that they should pay more to run those systems, and if you're a user, you should pay more to use those systems than to do email or something else, is logical, but it is fundamentally disagreeing with the concept of both the internet as utility and internet as commons. And so right now, most but not all of the protections have been removed from law. And what we're really relying on now for net neutrality is the agreements in the business sector between internet providers and companies like Netflix. One of the real problems with relying on something like that is that we don't know what those agreements are. There is no transparency and there is no long-term benefit, long-term guarantee. So with each of those things, it turns out that a variety of results can happen increasingly as even just in the last 3 or 4 years, as internet pricing for high content use platforms has gone up, the number of advertisements or the demand that you pay more to avoid advertisements as a way to offset the increased cost of using the internet backbone has been increasingly prevalent. And one of the silly, simple examples of this is that, for example, one of the ways that this is resulting is Hulu, for example, does not want to pay more. And so in order to guarantee that they can manage their relationship with ISPs, the reason that they will not allow you to use a regular Netflix account, you need a separate paid Netflix account to use a streaming device like a Roku or an Apple TV program on your TV, as opposed to watching on a laptop or your cell phone, is because they're managing those relationships by guaranteeing different versions of watching. And it changes both the way and how you use those platforms, but also the prices. And increasingly, because large companies purchase other companies, what we can see, again, there's a little graphic to visualize this. Verizon now owns Yahoo, Engadget, and a variety of content producers and distributor platforms. AT&T now has agreements with a number of them, including HBO. Comcast has an agreement with Hulu. But if you end up with internet provided by AT&T at your home and want to watch Hulu, they literally can slow your bit rate. There's no longer a protection to equal access to that basic service. And in the end, net neutrality really comes down to 4 key elements, what are key issues in the corner up there. One, who pays what for use, right? Is there an expectation of equitable pay? And if equitable pay is about everybody paying the same, that's their traditional model of net neutrality. Now, it is worth noting that ISPs argue that the equal access to information transfer on the backbone by companies like Netflix is not equitable. And so that discussion that we had about the difference between equal and equitable as a value, as a system for evaluation is really important here, because it may be legitimate to say that Netflix and HBO and Disney should be paying more. And then the question is, it may be a better way to regulate it to say that their profits should be reduced rather than the cost to users. What we really have to worry about in some ways is when these expenses start to limit access to things we need, like they sold in the last year and a half, they sold the .org management. So all of the nonprofits in the world were sold the management and processing of their web pages to a for-profit company, and not just a for-profit company that is explicitly Republican. And so what we're going to get, and what we've already seen in some cases, is the denial of access to the .org domain suffix. And that means that we are now moving political censorship into the zone of business market relations. And that means that, once again, we have to question whether the conception that we popularly see, that censorship is about government action, is not fundamentally different than the kinds of censorship we see by architecture or by business actions outside of government. Those questions of who can and who should pay are fundamental to this. It is, for instance, one element of net neutrality that it is now harder for left-wing, democratic, populist groups on the left to buy web pages than it was 2 years ago. And it's not impossible, but the legitimacy and the importance of having a .org domain suffix is genuine. Like it discredits them in a way that it also provides unfair power, if it's a neutral, equitable commons, for other groups. Part of the issue around net neutrality then isn't just about money. It's about who should have access to it. Who is the one who should be paying for it? And another part is who uses it too much. For instance, as people wanted more efficiency and cheaper processes, we've moved to almost 50 to 60% of the internet is now hosted by servers that are owned. The computers that actually run the websites are owned by Amazon Cloud and Business Services. And I should say about 50% of the non-Chinese internet, because China does not do as much here. There's a separate subsidiary in China that is not part of the same measure, although it is still owned by Amazon. Now, that's a real thing. Almost 50% is run by them. They are now another layer of controlling actor that is not the internet service provider. And in fact, one of the big arguments that makes net neutrality complicated is Amazon has effectively enacted net neutrality for all of the internet they service, because they act to moderate and negotiate pricing for the things hosted on their services. And one of the big challenges of this is that, again, you have to have enough money and enough size, enough scale to be able to get Amazon to host you in the business services plan to have access to those pricing. And that means that you literally are no longer talking about equitable pricing between everybody. Your equitable pricing is between those who have access to Amazon and those who don't. Third is who has a right to the internet, right? All of these questions about pricing, about equitable access, about excessive use, whether it's Netflix or Amazon, whether it is Americans disproportionately using it compared to Europeans or anybody else in the world, the question of who has access to and a right to the internet, if you answer that question ethically as being it is everybody, then we have a different question and a different set of answers. If you say the people who can afford it, the people who can pay for it, then you have to follow that through to the extreme and say, well, what if you could no longer afford the internet? Would it be an appropriate aspirational goal? Would it be a structurally acceptable goal? Would it be a positive or a negative ethic you would apply to say that some people shouldn't have internet? If you argue that only some people have the right to the internet, you are in fact saying some people should not have the right to the internet. That is, some people should not have access to it. And we're not talking about this as an absolute. You could argue that this is a social contract. For instance, we may want to deny somebody who's been found guilty of sexually molesting children, or somebody who's been found guilty of high treason, or somebody who is just a terrible troll. You can determine a different set of rules in a contract. But again, the moment you do that, unless you have a warrant that absolutely limits who has access to that contract, you're back in the position of saying it is possible for you to be excluded. This is the goal of using a rights-based system. And finally, how would you, as an observer, consider equity and equality of use and cost to be done appropriately? As an internet user, you should have some conception of what the basic ethics you want to apply in responding to this issue of net neutrality are. Net neutrality, by tradition, since about 2001, has argued the question of who pays what for use is everybody has to pay the same. Fundamentally, at the background level, everybody has to be equally able to pay it. And the moment that the price gets too high for the poorest people to have access to the internet, the price is too high. If that means that Netflix gets a good deal, fine. Net neutrality has traditionally said, can you use it too much? They, in fact, have had very little to say about this because traditionally they've argued that as long as the architecture provides equal access, use is not their issue. We have never run out of bandwidth. And the argument goes that the stewardship of members, not just ISPs, but of web providers, of systems, and even of users, if they were encouraged to maintain stewardship, would prevent excessive use from becoming a tragedy of the commons. Who has a right to the internet? Net neutrality's fundamental belief is that everybody not only has a need, but a right to access. And four, should there be equality of use and cost? This is, again, we don't necessarily have to say that there need to be equality of use. There does have to be equity of cost, right? So we assume that equity is different from equality in this class, and we don't often in general conversation. We assume fairness comes from the same. Net neutrality's warrant is that equity should be preserved for all people to have the right of access. And so in some ways, the question of should there be equality of use and cost is secondary. It may not be inequitable to charge Netflix more because while we do all have a necessary right to access to the internet, we may not all have a necessary right to Netflix or to HBO or to any other service that's laid upon that utility. Now, if we do all have a public need and therefore a public right, then that is what we would generally have described not just as a commons, but as a utility like telephones and electricity in the United States. And there are legal remedies for responding to the regulation of a utility that are established and functional. So we will take a moment to switch slides, and then we'll be talking about something else.
This week's readings, which follow spring break, I hope that you've all had time to check out. You may even have Googled these scholars, but to introduce them, Lawrence Lessig is an exceptional legal scholar. He is an expert on constitutional law, and in the early days of the internet, he became interested after hearing people discuss free speech and the non-governability, the inability to govern online, and originally wrote about all of the aspirational goals of the internet. And in Code 2.0, he updated that work to talk a much more detailed aspect, although some of the cases and examples in the book are very old and somewhat out of date. Part of what's really important in the book was that he looked at it and went, that conception of not being governed, of the Wild West, of the lack of regulation, failed to take into account a great many different kinds of regulations. And he is curious both in examining how those regulation forces, how the control of actions, how the prediction or influence on individual actions
take place online, but also he looks at it as a way that we can understand the internet differently. He says the both invisibility of regulation, that perception that it is ungoverned, that it is the Wild West, while also being highly structured, highly controlled, is part of the Constitution, that which makes it what it is. And so we'll talk a little both about his theory of regulation, which I think is a good heuristic or model for you to think about when you try and understand any piece of technology. And also, in particular, about what he sees as the nature of the internet as it exists. And the second set of reading was just some introductory components of Dr. Sherry Turkle's book, Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. Now, this is the third of 5 books that she has put together over about 15 years of doing detailed research on the way that technology interacts with and affects people, and in particular, how the way that we interact with technology, how we have a dialogue with technology, how it modifies and influences the way and the types of social interaction that we have. And so when she is looking at these individual anecdotes that are presented to you, I want you to understand that they are representative of a much larger body of research presented later in the work. The stories that she tells, including things like the example of Paro, the social robot, or of one of her graduate students' experience with Skype, those are meant to be examples or exemplars of phenomenon that she is documenting elsewhere. And while she is much more critical in the overt directive concern that she is presenting, please understand that she is not anti-technology, nor is she anti-internet. Her argument is that we need to be more aware and careful in how we are making these ethical and social choices. So the two of them actually come from very different traditions, and they are very different scholars in how they approach the internet. But we're looking at them in light of our discussion of ethics and in light of the readings in Winner and other elements before this, that the nature of the internet is going to have political effects. It is going to have social effects. It is going to have technical effects. And the way that that produces outcomes will, as Mathis and Gray said, have aggregate and significant social phenomenal outcomes. And one way to understand that is to consider the way that those outcomes are produced in complex regulation through complex choices. And that's what Lessig is talking about. And another way to do it is to look at how individuals experience and interact in small moments, and look at those stories to be able to see how larger stories are present. So we will begin by talking about Lessig, and then we'll move on to talking about Turkle, and then we'll end by wrapping them back together again. Lawrence Lessig's response to the internet all stems from his understanding and serious scholarly approach to looking at the Constitution of the United States. It begins not from the technical elements, but from an absolute expectation that at the core of any organized system is an organizing series of principles. And that could be the axioms in a math problem or anything else. And the reason that that's important is because if you look at how the law in the United States works, we have an incredibly complex system of law, but one of the primary regulators of how that system works, the relationship between common law and precedent, the relationship between individual states, the relationship between individuals and their government, those different complexities and different relationships are regulated by elements of the Constitution. And one of the things that he finds fascinating about the internet is that, like the Constitution and our legal system, in an incredibly complicated system, he says there are recognizable elements of core code or core constitution. And some of those we would recognize as obvious. There is the programming languages and technical elements, TCP/IP systems and TCP/IP systems and things like that. If you're aware of how the internet actually works, but he says people think of those as regulatory in a different way than law. And he wonders if that's accurate. He says if you have core elements that regulate the direct and control outcomes, they're active in that way and they have effects. And as we know from Langdon Winter's discussion of politics, anything that has directive effects can potentially be producing winners and losers, but that makes it political. And at the core of his beginning point, at the starting point for Lessig, is this concern that if we actually look at the growing importance of the internet, we will find that there are differences and effects that the politics of these choices have. And as he begins looking into the internet, to the transition to information and systems of communication being part of this comprehensive, complex thing, he finds that there is an assumption by the coders, by the people writing the internet, that it is not only not regulating itself, but that the sort of social space it is producing is unregulatable, ungovernable. And his book begins by engaging with that idea that, first of all, the kinds of technical regulation, the kinds of technical architecture that are being produced limit some outcomes, enable some outcomes. He recognizes the kind of nature of politics that we've talked about in this class, that STS talks a lot about. And he says, it is really important, if that is functioning like the Constitution of the United States, to be aware of what's included in that. And one of the things that he does is notice that it differentiates between publicly available and private knowledge, and assumes that everything that is within the user interface, within the content of the internet, is public, and everything that is back-end, all of the information that is involved in producing it, is invisible and not conceptually important. The internet, except for those people programming it, allows people to naturalize and black box its functions in ways that genuinely frighten Lessig. At the time, those debates are around the founding of things like net neutrality, as he sees those transitions and the growth of ownership of the internet, the potential challenges of developing a commons versus developing a balkanized owned system. He sees those issues, and he also sees that with the choices of how individual anonymity are being built, we will get different things. And one of the classic examples of this that he goes into in little parts in the book is that when we decide to produce a more functional internet, one which is easier to use, and we transition to the World Wide Web, the WWW system, Berners-Lee and his team prioritize the ease of access and the indexing of information. And there's a dramatic intensification of that, a dramatic increase when Google's popular search engine begins to be the internet standard. And one of the things that we find is, in order to have searchability and accessibility, in order for that control and use to be prioritized, the actual reality of anonymity on the internet effectively begins to disappear. And one of the things that becomes clear to Lessig in these transitions is that people's assumptions of behavior, of ways to use the internet, of how the internet should work, still assumes absolute anonymity. It still assumes that you have to actively choose to connect content to the internet to a name, or it will be anonymous. And even in the very early days of the internet, he says this is not true. There are technical barriers that allow for or prevent anonymity. And if you are one of the people who has the technical skills to use those things, then nobody is anonymous. And if you're not one of the people in this system who knows how to do it, then everybody is anonymous. And he sees this and he looks at a system that by its nature of the code, that is of the technological and systematic architecture, produces fundamental imbalances of power. And as a constitutional scholar, the US Constitution is extremely flawed, but its fundamental premise is institutional production of power, which is both transparent, that is where we know why and how the processes operate, but also what the power is and who gets it. And as a constitutional scholar, he looks at this developing internet and he says, the scariest thing about this is that no one is quite sure who's going to end up with power. And with that, we get a huge number of the modern problems. We get the fighting over intellectual property, who owns what. Well, we can transfer information, but it is all owned. Peer-to-peer things like the Pirate Bay in the early generation that he's talking about in the book of Napster. Peer-to-peer is a fundamentally threatening technology because it is not a property ownership technology. It is a cooperative sharing of information ownership technology. And all sorts of technologies that are being produced within the internet, within this larger framework, can either be made more possible or less possible. And the peer-to-peer option is one of the clear examples of this. Peer-to-peer, it presumes, in allowing people to avoid property ownership rights, it presumes anonymity. The reality of it is quite more difficult. As many people know, downloading from Pirate Bay, downloading from other peer users, while you are just doing something that is the standard enabled function of the internet, you can get, I mean, it is very rare in this day and age to go to jail for it, but you can in fact be a criminal for doing this activity. And so the enablement of functions of the internet without recognition and response from other systems of regulation become this dramatic and important issue. He wants us to recognize that direct and indirect forms of control over our behavior are operating at the same time. And it is easy to say, yes, there's a direct form of control. If my internet is turned off, if I've unplugged my laptop or turned off the wireless antenna, I cannot get on the internet. Done. Direct control. But expectations, beliefs, market forces, law, all sorts of other regulatory forms, and how they are able to act on the internet form a central constitution of the internet that he says is very, not just important, but worrying in that we are allowing people to produce that constitution without either transparency or oversight. For instance, the decision to eliminate the allowance for anonymity as a general on the internet is largely a decision made by Google or by the users of Google who choose without being aware that that is what they're choosing. They are told they have the choice of a good search engine or no search engine. In presenting that Hobson's choice, that very limited form of choice, Google did not point out that the choice was between allowing the possibility of open, individualized systems of information use and anonymity, or letting Google have all control. Google now controls nearly 75% of information accessed that is generally information access. That is, people go directly to lots of websites, but if somebody goes onto the internet without a specific destination in mind, about 75% of internet users globally will participate with Google. And that includes their subsidiaries like YouTube. But it is a huge amount of power to give to a company that has neither responsibility nor promise that they will be responsible to their users in anything but minimal sense. And he wants us to ask the question, what is the constitution of the internet? Now, at the center of that, we will come back after we talk about the complex regulatory systems that we're talking about. Because I think that in the core of the internet, he wants to argue the allowance for information transfer is still based on a core constitutive, constructive idea. And that idea is that information transfer is both a right, as is envisioned by the net neutrality commons, but also that the technical capacities of the internet being built to allow faster and faster, better and more reliable information transfer are motivated largely by that right. And his ethical argument, which is not the core of the book, but as an ethical precept, that means that if the warrant, if the justification for the internet itself is the open and unlimited access to the internet, that is unlimited open access to information, then we have actually been building increasingly more and more technologies onto it that limit and try and modify that. Now, I know that some of you will be sitting there going, well, there are new technologies that are attempting to reintroduce anonymity, things like VPNs and private network accesses, and those things do exist, but the need for them is produced by other technologies. And so as we move into the next slide, understand that the system of regulation that we're talking about is complex, and it is, in the social science, we'll say it's generationally iterative, right? The information exchange on the internet is completely open and anonymous. A company that can profit by making the information not open and not anonymous builds something which is then layered on top of the open internet. Once people recognize that a new need is produced, a smaller technology allows for that possibility. But in fact, it is very difficult to claim that occasional expensive or difficult access to VPNs balances out for general access to open internet. And that's the basic premise. So Lessig presents the theory of regulation around what he calls the dot. And really, the dot is just a stand-in for anything that you're talking about. We could, in fact, very legitimately say that this is just the artifact or the subject of regulation that you're focused on. And he says one way to conceptualize how anything is being affected is that at all times, four factors or general types of regulation are in effect. There is market, and the market is economic forces and interests, interests being every person desiring to produce ends to their desired effect, as opposed to either necessarily cooperative or general and outside interests. It is a recognition of the political conflict that limited resources in an economy can have. And so generally when we're talking about the market, we're talking about money, economics, and business. There is law, and that is formal regulation, and that can be administrative, regulatory, or statutory in the United States as limits. And they derive legitimacy in the United States from legal constitutions. The internet is a globalized or transnational entity, object. And as such, in fact, the documents derive their legal legitimacy from international treaties of law, not from the U.S. Constitution fundamentally. But there are systems of warrant which produce formal oversight and formal limitations. And law is characterized by directed implementation. That is, you can see the rule ahead of time, it produces an outcome, and enforcement and punishments. And one of the things that's important about law is that it is that directed implementation. We can see how and what the systems of warrant are. And that is not true except by assumption in market forces. At the same time, architecture, that is the material, the technical enablements and constraints, the actual computer parts, the wires, the limitations of signal transmission by satellite, those technical elements, the programming languages and the overlapping usage of different standards and formats within the computers, are an inbuilt politics. They are functions, direct push-pull, and they're functional elements of design that are intended to encourage or direct selection. They produce available outcomes, and they're enabling and constraining. And Lessig looks here for the core or the constitution of the thing. He says the key element of this, because they're more of the key reason for doing the attention to the core constitution in the object itself, in the architecture, is that the technology is at the same time changeable. We can swap out computer programs, we can reprogram, we can do a different thing. It has been almost exactly 20 years since we completed the transition to the web as we know it in terms of the architecture, but oddly enough, it is actually very changeable. But the thing that makes it so important is that once it's built, we assume it is not changeable. It is static, and it will not change without outside interference, without people making a determination. And that this is distinct from the other forces which have a natural process of in the modern world, a natural process of modification. Laws change over time, markets change over time, but there is what's called legacy effect of technical decisions in the past that produce the architecture. So for instance, it is no longer accurate to describe the internet as anonymous, but we still do a lot of informational structuring of the internet as if every individual user and every IP address was anonymously assigned. And that means that this is both an opportunity to recognize all sorts of ongoing processes, what the push-pulls are, but it also means that at a practical level, you can get incredible response by making changes here. If you can make changes within the architecture, you can perform functional modifications that change how the other things, the market forces, the law, and almost most importantly, what the social forces are also. And it's, in some ways, the social forces that we're looking to Sherry Turkle in the next reading about. Because one of the things that consistently confuses Lessig is that as he begins his research, he recognizes that beliefs, norms, expectations, assumptions, and patterns of behavior really do both shape the technologies of the internet, but then they also mean that the capacities, constraints, and enablements that the internet offers are not necessarily enacted, they're not used. The speed of communication may not allow certain processes to be going at that speed. The speed of communication may not be used. The kinds of opportunities the internet allows are not taken up in all places. And he says, it is this complexity of social interactions, right, the conceptual and cognitive constitution, that is the largest limiting factor of the architecture. right? The governing mentalities, the norms, all these things that perform as subtle politics, that establish and interact with identity and human participation, have an incredible effect on modifying technology. And he says at any given time, all four of these forces of regulation are active on the dot on anything you look at. And that includes us. Anytime we're making a decision, we are responding to our conceptions of these four things. Is it against the law? Is there a value? Is there a system of enablement? If you cannot fly because of gravity, that is architecture. If you can fly because airplanes modify that architecture, that's great, but it still costs money to get on a plane. Markets work. We legally regulate planes. We require identification. We have lots of laws that affect that. And then at the same time, if you are personally terrified of planes, or you believe that you have to work, or you don't travel, or if you have norms such as you would need to save a certain amount of money up so you're not going to go broke if you do travel, those are equivalent barriers or regulations to travel on a plane. No one component there is as powerful as would need be to erase all the others. Now, in the book, there's a fair amount of detail on these, and in different parts of the book, he points out very specific things. So it is extremely likely, because we pay coders and technical professionals to build the architecture, it is very likely that you can recognize how market forces have a direct effect on architecture. And if you've ever studied or thought about economics, it is very clear that social forces shape market, right? If nobody wants something, it stops being valuable, people stop selling it. And that was arguably the case with anonymity. People wanted anonymity online, then they didn't want it, so we stopped selling it. And one of the things that happens there is that both market forces and social forces have an influence on what laws are formed. But because laws are transparent and directive, they are often the best way to modify both market and social forces. If we can recognize social patterns, if we can recognize market patterns, whether that is an excessive monopoly, whether that is too high prices to allow some people and you want to increase the equity of the system, we use laws to limit or to modify the effect of market and social forces, if they're done. And one of the things that happens by nature is that as the social forces, as the market forces, and almost more importantly, as architecture changes, laws either have to be changed or they turn into problems. If a law, for example, requires a warrant, a legal warrant, a recognized documented form of warrant, to be able to access private information, but your private information is hosted by a for-profit company that is willing to give it out, as is the case, for example, with Gmail. Gmail is very easy for the government to access. They can read your mail. Well, they can read your mail with a very simple warrant, but it would be very difficult for them to use postal mail. We built laws to prevent them from reading your postal mail. And so recognizing that it is no longer the same as postal mail to look at your Gmail or your email is very different. The time involved, the ease of access to that information means that the old law that protects people from search of your mail no longer is useful. Similarly, if it would sound ridiculous to be able to say anybody should be able to look at the pictures you take of your boyfriend, girlfriend, yourself, your friend naked, but by posting something on the internet, because the architecture of the internet is still struggling against a basic core principle in the Constitution that all information is for everybody, having private information on the internet, in the cloud, is extremely difficult. If we want to modify those reactions, those interpretations and structures of the architecture, we can do that with the architecture, we can do that with encryption, or we can do that with law. For example, in the United States, we relatively recently made laws that said the posting, publication, profit, or use of revenge porn, whether it's hacked and stolen or whether it's simply something that somebody gave you but you're publishing without their permission, is a crime. But until the law is actually produced in such a way that it is implemented and enforced, the overriding regulatory effect will be the ease of access on the internet. And that is to say, yeah, as long as we do not apply that law to prevent it, everybody should assume that all information on the internet will eventually be public. And he says, if we look at the interaction of these forces, as you have in the little diagram from the book, the arrows pressing, usually when I replicate this on the board, I put arrows between them, that at the same time as any one thing is being pressed on and pushed, being controlled in both subtle and overt ways, the negotiation and interactions here are also changing these regulatory forces. New cases produce new law, new experiences by many people produce new norms, and lots of different actors, whether it's legal, market, or social, end up having a force effect on markets. And so over time, whether it's the negotiation of net neutrality and intellectual property, we see a very specific pattern of regulatory function happening. And Lessig would like us to consider this as a model because it also, he argues, is an explanation of why it's so difficult for people to understand legal constitutional effects. Now we'll come back to Lessig after we talk about Turkle a bit. Dr. Sherry Turkle, who is a psychoanalyst, psychologist, and acts as an anthropologist doing qualitative studies of the nature of human and computer interaction, is an expert with 10 years in the field. And I want you to understand that I'm establishing that she's an expert before I also say she is fundamentally a different generation than you. Her way of interacting and thinking about her perceptions of these technologies will not be the same as yours. And a classic example of this is she, like many people in her generation, perceives the use of technologies in social situations as a substitution and not an enrichment. And that's one of the elements of this book that people sometimes have trouble with. While she's very careful, the question is left unanswered to what degree these are substitutions or enrichments of social interactions. And one of the things that I think is particularly useful about the book, and why I don't try and give you one of the sections on the internet itself, is that in the first half of the book where she talks about social robotics, she has explicitly selected a form of social technology that is a substitution. It is not the case that Siri or Google Assistant is meant to enrich social interaction. It is meant to replace secretaries, librarians. You guys won't even be aware, but there were these things called answer lines at libraries in the New York Times, where if you needed to know an answer, a complex thing, they had the kind of answers you'd look for Google for. And the replacement aspect is really important because when we look at a complex social interaction as being replaced by a technology, whether that's a technology of traditional automation, the replacement of work by a teller at a bank by an automated teller machine, or baggers and cashiers at a grocery store by an automated checkout, whether that's a manufacturing device that replaces craftsmen in a factory. There is an established reality to the politics of that replacement. And so in talking about the importance of thinking about technologies, and in particular about social technologies, one of the fundamental things you have to remember is you cannot disprove that these are substitutions. You can argue that they are enrichments instead of just substitutions, but social technologies inevitably, history has shown, replace prior ways of doing things. And so her argument comes not from a questioning of the details of the technology. It comes from a questioning of what forms of socialization are becoming more common. And her argument is that even a technology that was conceived as enriching rather than substituting may become a substitution technology over time. And the reason for that is slightly complicated, but I'm going to make it simple. When we talk, when we interact, when we do social things, we do them based on learned patterns of how to socially interact. And when we relocate those social interactions into what's called technological mediation, when we move to talking online or the phone, using a technology to do that socialization, by the nature of that mediation, some degree of change happens. When we record music, we can either record it digitally or acoustically, and we can choose to eliminate or modify the sound. Very few people pay much attention to technological mediation, but Sherry Turkle pays a lot of it. She is extremely concerned with those tiny little variations in how we socialize, how we interact. And it's an important thing because coming from her background in psychology, she says, we are in dialogue with the objects as well as the people around us. We learn about ourselves, about the world, by engaging with them. And that means that as the objects and technologies and techniques and ways of participating in social interaction change, they do have a cumulative effect in changing us. And she's not a crazy, panicked person saying cell phones are ruining society. She's a person saying cell phones will have an effect. And let's take a careful look at what kinds of effects those are and which of them potentially we want to modify and prevent, which of them are good and which of them are unavoidable because of the core elements of the technology. At one level, the technologies promote and influence in different ways is just obvious. We've talked about it all semester. And she's focused on two of these ways. One is questioning the substitution versus enrichment provided by a technology. If everybody walked instead of driving cars, we'd be a lot healthier. That's a substitution technology. The reality is that we may not be willing to exchange the health benefits of walking everywhere for the speed and utility of driving. But there may be other options. And by recognizing the substitution and the political, ethical, health, etc. effects, we can make a better decision. And the other element that she is particularly interested in is that as ease and efficiency is considered all important, it takes over for what it can seem to be more important than what is made easy and efficient. And a classic silly example of this is everybody knows that a finely crafted homemade meal by somebody who loves you and cooks for you is going to be better than a TV dinner or a prepared food dinner. But in terms of technology, we have spent millions and millions of man hours and billions of dollars developing better TV dinners over the last 55 to 65 years. And TV dinners from the freezer, from a can, from a box in the cabinet, fundamentally are never going to be as good at some level as having somebody you care about and cares about you cook for you, or you cook for somebody you care about. The nature of it is two different things at a substance or qualitative level. But we can, by focusing on the ease and efficiency of this process of having pre-prepared foods, ignore those substantive differences. And Sherry Turkle does not care about TV dinners because at a fundamental level, her concern is not about somebody having one meal that is good or bad. The nature of social interaction produces the nature of society. And she says, look, at a fundamental level, the nature of how we live is going to be changed. The nature of how we live is changing already. And we can begin the process of looking through those changes. And a few of the elements that she picks out are that the nature of authenticity versus what I'll call verisimilitude is changing. And a classic example of this that we might be familiar with from animation and drawing and movies is what's called the uncanny valley. It's also a term that derives from robotics and artificial personhood. And the uncanny valley is the point at which you can recognize that something is filling the space of or acting like a person, but it is not close enough or truthful enough in that position. So it makes it a little creepy. And you can probably think of the recent release of Cats. You can think of all sorts of television, movies, comics that produce this effect. And in fact, it's sometimes worth noticing that recognizing the uncanny valley, recognizing the failure of authenticity, is a useful effect for horror movies. Classic examples of horror movie visual effects are often done by producing failures of authenticity. When you see a person on the screen and they don't have a shadow, when you see a person on the screen and you've played with the motion so their motion doesn't look human, there are a variety of techniques to producing effects intentionally. But what we're really doing most of the time is not producing authenticity. We're not making something that is true to life. We're making something that has verisimilitude, that is the feeling or perception of truthfulness. So for instance, no one thinks a smiley face, two dots and a curved line in a circle, looks like a face. But we have learned to see it as a face. And part of that is about recognizing specific architectural elements of human cognition. We tend to see faces when we see those patterns. But part of that is also that you learn to see a smiley face, an emoji, as a face. And what it turns out is that while learning authenticity, learning about the real world in all its complexity is very hard, one of the forms of standardization that technology can get engaged with is verisimilitude. And so something like the voice of Siri or of other robots, the way that they interact and answer questions are largely being guided by verisimilitude and not by authenticity. And she says that's actually okay in some cases when we're talking about the social robotics examples. No one wants to be confused that Siri is a real person in your pocket. No one wants a robot that is 100% human because humans are cranky and emotional problematic or whatever. They are not doing it. What you want is verisimilitude. You want something that does not produce a negative response, something that we can teach. And the large section on social robotics, which focuses, for example, on the use of the Paro, the seal robot that's on your screen. The Paro robot is designed because the aging of the Japanese population has meant that there are too few people to not just care for, but to socialize with. And it is worth noticing that that I'm distinguishing between having somebody care for you and having somebody socialize with you, because often one of the things that we can value in socializing for other people is taking care of them. So one of the things that people recognized in looking at patterns and ways that people socialize and interact in Japan was that simply having somebody else take care of you may satisfy some needs, but for many of the elderly Japanese people, having a pet was difficult, whereas having a robot that they could take care of, that they could be affectionate with, satisfied other needs. It was not looking for authenticity. And much like our discussion at the beginning of this lecture on standardization, what we're really looking for here is control of which information is being used. And much of the function in human-computer interaction and in user interface design is about this, whether it's something as simple as putting a label or an icon on something, or whether it's the design of an animal robot to substitute for social interaction. How you choose which information is going to have both functional effects and political ones. The determination that authenticity, or the recognition that authenticity and verisimilitude are different things, is fundamentally important to understanding Turkle's argument, because she argues that technologies for communication are almost always built for speed and control. And her argument is centers on the idea that in designing technologies for speed and control, we do not design for authenticity, we design for verisimilitude. And in that sense, we are choosing which social interaction to replicate. In the case of one of her examples, what we're talking about there is the difference between telephones and text messages. On the telephone, it is faster and more controlled. You produce one message, you send it, you get a specific message back. It is unlikely to produce chit-chat and long conversations. And by contrast, you have less control, and it is more likely to be a longer process on the telephone to speak to somebody. And this is an important example because she uses it to talk about the fact that this pairing of authenticity and verisimilitude, which we can see in something like the Uncanny Valley, also is replicated in the control versus intimacy binary that she wants to talk about. That producing certain kinds of speed and control is in contrast to intimacy. And part of that is psychologists have shown that, for instance, the risk involved in giving social control of an interaction to somebody else and having them produce a positive outcome is one of the central ways that we build intimacy and trust. And so her argument here is that in many cases, when we move into the internet as opposed to social robotics, the way we learn to interact, our comfort level, the overall process of using these technologies, even aside from the individual uses of the technologies, entrains us, teaches us, shapes our preference for a dialogue with technologies with other people that is about control and not intimacy. And when she gets into the examples of that later, it becomes a much more detailed thing. But this is the core of it, that if we are choosing to emphasize and standardize for certain traits, including speed and control, we may be eliminating and substituting for other social values, including intimacy. And over time, as that familiarity and entrained preference builds up, not just in individuals, but we can see it building up in a social process across many people, what we end up with is a situation where significant social change has happened. And I like this quote: once we remove ourselves from the flow of physical, messy, untidy life, and both robotics and network life do that, as in remove us from messiness, we become less willing to get out there and take chances otherwise. And I sometimes, when we, believe it or not, this is actually the shorter version of this lecture than it sometimes is, where we end up going much of both days of the week. We talk about the growing, one of the ways that she doesn't talk about, but other people have studied, the growing tendency for control as opposed to intimacy, in fact, has been very widely measured in the use of dating apps and dating sites, replacing social interactions in public spaces, things like meeting people in bars and church. And that vastly common is the perception that the unpredictability of outcomes is undesirable. But we also see people that in the unpredictability and the trust formed in them in meet cutes and in social interactions, meeting through friends, other kinds of face-to-face, we find there are statistically measurable increased intimacy and increased longevity of relationships. Believe it or not huge, because it turns out people can be dishonest, people can take a long time, people can be socially awkward. And in fact, one of the things that we're finding is that over time, the past trend that people who meet online will have shorter, less intimate relationships are actually decreasing. And we're getting a replacement trend where people are preferentially choosing long-term relationships online by selecting people who they will effectively be able to have a long-term relationship, people who spend their time in the same way, people who have personal and social activities that they feel they can match. And that this represents a form of control that is very specific and that is replacing systems of intimacy that were different in the old ways. Again, Turkle is looking at this. Many scholars look at this and see substitution as being counter to enrichment. And that means that what we're asking is that if you are building a technology, if you're considering the politics of a technology, what are the trade-offs? If you choose to emphasize just control, are you trading off against intimacy? Are you having other effects? So to say that's an important aspect, but the nature of it is very simply, when we build technologies, we are producing the training for the social interactions of the future, and it should be taken seriously to do that. Thanks very much. All right, I've gone on long enough, so I'm going to try and wrap this up fairly quickly. What we see in Lessig and Turkle are a pair of people trying to discuss how technology has ethical implications, and in particular, how the complex system that we call the internet and communication technologies that are related to it have begun to have significant compartmented and then general effects on how people interact. And in each of their different ways, what they want to focus on is one particular problem that we can look at as a specific component of our ethical attention. So Lessig asks us to pay attention to transparency. And not in an abstract way. He literally says, when governments step aside, it is not as if nothing takes its place. The perception that things aren't regulated, that anybody can do what they want online, meant that we do not have much in the way of law there, right? But he's very skeptical of the idea that that is fundamentally good. He says it's not as if private interests have no interests, as if private interests don't have ends that they will then pursue. To push the anti-government button is not to teleport us to Eden when the interests of government are gone. Other interests take their place. Do we know what those interests are? Are we so certain they're better? And his argument here is very straightforward. You, as young people who've grown up on the internet, you often assume that government will make things worse. And his real central point is that, in fact, many kinds of regulation exist. And in fact, one of the only ways to make improvements around in response to market forces, social forces, and other elements of those regulatory systems is really to look for government action, and that is regulation. And because the systems are transparent and predictable in useful ways, legal action is often a very viable way to respond to and modify technical responses. And by comparison, almost the same idea, they both look at the commons, and Sherry Turkle says that the nature of the commons will change if the technology that produces it changes. Right? And we may want to do that with laws. We may want to do that with something else. I think in many ways, her argument is we would need to change our social relations not the laws, because you can't necessarily do the kinds of change she wants to do. Not getting rid of cell phones, but to be attentive and aware to how we are using technologies. Digital connections and social robots may offer the illusion of companionship, she says, without the demands of friendship. And that can provide an interesting point of attention, right? We're living in a moment of quarantine, of distancing and social isolation, and many of us are reliant on these technologies for our social interaction. It is a good time to be paying attention to what their enablements and constraints are. She, later in the book, she says, human relationships are rich and they're messy and they're demanding, and if we clean them up with technology, texting, email, posting, all of these things let us present the self as we want to be. And we get to edit, and that means we get to delete, and that means we get to retouch. The face, the voice, the flesh, the body, not too little, not too much, just right. And her concern is that by producing more and more perfect things, we make it harder, less acceptable for people to be imperfect. I think that'll be a good place to end it, for us to bring up discussion in the discussion room on Canvas. I remind you that this will be the first week that you guys are required to begin participating there. Again, I'm sorry for the late posting, and thanks very much.